What's your plan?
Well, the first thing I have to do is to cut some records, and then after that I have the television show with...
Elvis Presley's death left the world mourning a legend, but behind the music and fame, a storm unfolded over his estate. From mysterious signatures to disputed documents and blocked deals at Graceland, lawyers uncovered shocking irregularities. Was the king's will truly what it seemed, or was there something hidden in the shadows of his legacy? Stay with us as we find out what happened. How lawyers saved Elvis's estate. When Elvis Presley passed away in August of 1977, the world mourned a star, a legend, a voice that had changed music forever. Fans around the globe lit candles, played his records, and remembered the man who had given so much joy. But behind the grief and the headlines, a quieter, more complicated story was unfolding. One about money, responsibility, and the people tasked with protecting the legacy of a man who had left so much behind. After Elvis's passing, the estate he left behind became a tangled web, a puzzle that would require careful hands to sort out. And those hands were the hands of lawyers. Elvis had earned an enormous fortune over his life. He had sold millions of records, performed in countless concerts, and starred in movies that drew fans in by the thousands. Yet despite this wealth, the first years after his death revealed a shocking truth. The estate was not in perfect order. Bills had piled up, investments were mismanaged, and the enormous house at Graceland required attention, maintenance, and oversight. It was clear that running the empire of Elvis Presley's life was not going to be simple, and so the court stepped in to ensure that the legacy would not be lost amidst the chaos. A judge, seeing the challenges the estate faced, appointed a special lawyer to step in and examine everything. This man, Blanchard Toole, became the guardian of Elvis's fortune, responsible for tracing the flow of money, understanding the accounts, and discovering how the estate had been managed before the king's death. Imagine the weight of such a task. Billions of dollars in today's terms, a sprawling mansion filled with priceless items, and the eyes of the world watching every decision. It was a responsibility that required not only legal expertise, but also a sense of care and understanding for the family and their unique circumstances. As Toole began to dig into the estate's finances, and it became clear that the situation was more complicated than anyone had expected. Elvis's longtime manager, a man who had been with him for years and who had overseen many aspects of his career, had left gaps, oversights, and, in some cases, questionable decisions in the management of money. Records were incomplete, payments were delayed, and some investments were either poorly handled or completely forgotten. It was a moment of revelation that demonstrated how even the life of someone as famous as Elvis could be vulnerable when proper oversight was missing. Toole's investigation was meticulous. He looked through endless stacks of papers, bank statements, contracts, and receipts. Every corner of Elvis's empire was examined carefully. How were the royalties from his music being collected? Were there payments owed from movie deals? Were the properties, cars, and other possessions properly accounted for? Each question was an essential piece of understanding how to secure Elvis's legacy for the people he loved most. His father, Vernon, his daughter, Lisa Marie, and his grandmother. What Toole discovered was eye-opening. Some of the money had been mismanaged, and some of the business decisions made by the manager had created risks that could have cost the estate millions. Yet there was no malice involved. Rather, it was the result of oversight, the kind of mistakes that can happen when wealth grows quickly and is handled by people who may not always plan for the future. In a way, it showed just how human the story was. Even the king of rock and roll, with all his fame and fortune, was not immune to the complexities of money, responsibility, and trust. This is where the role of lawyers became vital. They did not change the will that Elvis had written, nor did they attempt to rewrite history. Instead, their task was to protect the intentions of the king. They ensured that the instructions Elvis had carefully laid out in 1977, who would inherit, how trusts would be managed, and when Lisa Marie would receive her inheritance, were respected and honored. They acted as guardians, translating the wishes of a man who had passed into practical reality, protecting his family from financial mistakes, and guiding them through the complex world of estates and legal obligations. It was not only about money, it was about preserving memories, protecting a home, and honoring the man who had given so much to so many. Lawyers became storytellers in their own way, all piecing together the life of Elvis through the documents, contracts, and evidence left behind. Every check, every letter, and every note provided insight into a life lived at full speed. A man who had touched millions, and a family trying to navigate the aftermath of loss. The challenges were enormous. Graceland itself was a treasure trove of personal items, awards, memorabilia, and art. Each item had value, both sentimental and financial, and decisions about what to sell, what to preserve, and what to manage were incredibly delicate. Imagine walking into a room where a gold record hangs on the wall, a costume from a famous performance is displayed, and the walls themselves have absorbed the music and laughter of Elvis Presley. The lawyers, in their careful investigation, they always had to respect every piece of that history while also making practical decisions for the estate's survival. And survival was not guaranteed. In the early years after Elvis's death, the estate faced the real possibility of financial collapse. Without proper oversight, bills could go unpaid, investments could fail, and the legacy of one of the most iconic figures in history could be lost. Yet, because of the careful work of Blanchard Tual and other legal professionals, the estate was stabilized, funds were recovered, and the family could focus on honoring Elvis in their own ways. Lisa Marie, his young daughter, would eventually inherit what her father had intended, and the family's connection to Graceland was preserved for generations to come. And to fully understand how the whole issue started, well, let's uncover what Elvis wrote in his will. Elvis's final words and legacy. In the summer of 1977, the world was stunned by the sudden passing of a man who had become more than just a singer, more than just a performer. Elvis Presley, a name that echoed across radios, television screens, and the hearts of millions, had left the world too soon. Yet, behind the glittering stage lights, the roaring crowds, and the dazzling jumpsuits, there was a quieter story waiting to be told, one about family, love, and the careful planning of the life he had built. This story begins with a piece of paper, a document that would guide the future of his estate long after his music had stopped playing. This was the will of Elvis Presley, a legal testament to how he wanted his world arranged when he was no longer there to oversee it himself. Elvis died on August 16, 1977. The news alone was enough to shake the foundations of popular culture, but it also brought with it practical questions. Who would care for the treasures he had accumulated, the home he loved, and the people closest to him? For that, we look at the will, a careful blueprint for the management of his estate. It might not carry the flash of a Las Vegas performance, but in its own way, it tells a story just as personal and intimate. At the heart of this will was a man who had always stood quietly in the background, but was fiercely loyal and protective of his son, Vernon Presley, Elvis's father. Vernon was entrusted with the responsibility of executor. This meant he was in charge of making sure that everything Elvis had worked for, everything he had earned, and everything he valued would go exactly where Elvis intended. It was a position that required great care, patience, and judgment. Vernon, who had raised his son through trials and triumphs, now carried the weight of ensuring that Elvis's wishes were honored after his passing. The will was very clear in its directions. Most of Elvis's money, property, and possessions were to be divided among the people who had been pillars in his life. Vernon himself was included, of course, not just as executor, but as a recipient, recognizing the role he had played in guiding and supporting Elvis through the years. Another person mentioned was Elvis's grandmother. Though less often in the spotlight, Maishi had been a source of wisdom and stability for Elvis, a figure who had seen him through his earliest struggles and understood the pressures that came with fame. And finally, there was Lisa Marie Presley, Elvis's daughter, who had only recently been born into a world that would forever know her as the child of a legend. She represented the future, the next generation who would carry forward a part of Elvis's legacy. But there was more to this plan than simply listing names. Elvis wanted to make sure that Lisa Marie, his beloved daughter, would be protected and cared for until she was ready to make her own decisions. To do this, he created a trust, a legal arrangement that would hold his assets safely and allow them to grow until Lisa Marie reached an age where she could inherit them responsibly. In the will, it was specified that she would come into her full inheritance when she turned 25. This careful planning reflected Elvis's concern not just for wealth, but for wisdom, for timing, and for ensuring that the young life of his daughter would be guided by structure and security, even after he was gone. Imagine the world of Elvis Presley, a man adored by millions, traveling constantly, performing in grand arenas, living amidst a whirlwind of fame. And yet, within that world, he paused to write down his intentions, to think about the ordinary yet vital aspects of life. The will may not carry the excitement of a hit song or the energy of a sold-out concert, but it carries a depth of care and thoughtfulness that shows a different side of Elvis. Behind the public persona of the king of rock and roll was a man who loved his family fiercely, who thought carefully about the future, and who understood that some of life's most important moments happen quietly, on paper, with ink, and with intention. Vernon Presley would carry out these wishes with care. He faced the enormous task of managing a fortune that was already vast, yet growing in complexity as Elvis's legacy expanded after his death. Graceland, the mansion that had been Elvis's home, was a symbol of his life, and its management became part of the responsibility outlined in the will. All the money, the royalties, the memorabilia, and the properties had to be accounted for, organized, and protected. It was a job that required more than just legal skill. It required devotion, patience, and a deep understanding of the man whose life had touched so many hearts. The will also reflected a practical awareness. Elvis had achieved extraordinary success, and with that success came not only wealth, but also exposure to risk, to management challenges, and to the pressures of fame. By creating a structured plan, he ensured that those closest to him would be shielded from some of the chaos that could come in the years after his death. In the quiet lines of the document, we can see his thoughtfulness, his foresight, and his enduring love for those he left behind. And so, when we look back on that moment in 1977, when Vernon Presley took on the solemn responsibility of executing the will, we see more than just legal obligations. We see a story of care and foresight. We see a man who, despite the bright lights, all the applause, and the worldwide attention, understood the importance of family and responsibility. The will becomes more than a legal instrument. It becomes a window into the heart of Elvis Presley. It is easy to forget that behind every legend is a life filled with ordinary human decisions. The choice to leave a clear and organized will, the decision to create a trust for a young daughter, and the selection of a trusted family member as executor are all deeply human acts. They reflect thoughtfulness, love, and responsibility, qualities that are just as meaningful as any gold record or sold-out show. Elvis's will showed us that even in a life marked by extraordinary fame, attention, and spectacle, the quiet moments of preparation and care for loved ones remain essential. Through this document, we see a man who cared for the future, who thought carefully about how to protect and provide for the people he loved most. Vernon Presley, Lisa Marie, and his grandmother became not only beneficiaries of a fortune, but also custodians of a legacy carefully constructed to endure beyond the flashing lights of stage and screen. However, there was a lot of feud attached to the will, so keep watching to know how everything went down. Family battles over Elvis's estate. In the decades following Elvis Presley's passing, the echoes of his life did not fade. His music continued to fill radios and homes. His movies continued to entertain new generations. And Graceland remained a beacon of memory and admiration. Yet behind the celebrations of his life, a quieter and more complicated drama was unfolding, a story of family, trust, and the challenges of safeguarding a legacy that was as valuable emotionally as it was financially. This chapter is about the delicate battles that took place within the Presley family, where documents, signatures, and intentions were questioned, and where even the most trusted plans were sometimes brought under scrutiny. As time passed, some of the papers that guided Elvis's estate began to attract attention in courts. Legal documents that were supposed to direct how his wealth should be managed and inherited were examined with great care. Lawyers reviewed every line, every mark, and every instruction. The reason was simple. In a family with fame, fortune, and history intertwined, questions could arise about whether everything had been handled as Elvis intended. Even small details in a signature, a date, or a witness could become crucial. One of the most notable moments in this ongoing story involved Priscilla Presley, Elvis's former wife. Years after the king's death, she and her legal team raised concerns about the estate documents related to her daughter, Lisa Marie Presley. They examined the papers carefully, looking for anything that seemed off, and what they found was enough to bring the documents into court for review. Some lines were unclear, some wording seemed inconsistent, and the signature, a mark that was supposed to guarantee authenticity, appeared unusual. In the eyes of the family's lawyers, these inconsistencies were enough to question whether the documents fully reflected the wishes of the people involved. Imagine a courtroom filled with careful attention, where lawyers, judges, and family members focus on a sheet of paper. Every word matters. Every mark tells a story. In this case, the story suggested that not everything may have been exactly as it should have been. The papers were supposed to ensure that Lisa Marie, Elvis's only child, would receive her inheritance in a clear and orderly way. But questions about whether the documents were properly witnessed or signed created uncertainty, making it necessary to review them in detail. This situation is exactly the kind that gives rise to the phrase, "That document was not the original." It is not about accusing anyone of wrongdoing immediately. Instead, it is about recognizing that when a life is lived in extraordinary circumstances, mistakes can happen, and even official documents may need to be clarified. The Presley family, like many others who inherit fame and fortune, face the delicate task of making sure that the original intentions of their loved one were preserved while also navigating the legal system carefully. These battles were not just about money. They were about trust, respect, and ensuring that the legacy of Elvis Presley was honored. Lisa Marie was growing up in a world that knew her only as the daughter of a legend, and the adults around her worked to create a future where she could inherit not just wealth, but a meaningful and protected legacy. Graceland, the home her father had loved so deeply, was more than a house filled with memorabilia. It was a symbol of family history, of memories, and of a life lived at full intensity. Protecting it meant careful legal work, thoughtful oversight, and the willingness to challenge documents when there was even the slightest doubt about their validity. The lawyers involved in these cases became stewards of the Presley legacy. Their work required patience, attention to detail, and a deep understanding of both the family's needs and the historical significance of the estate. They reviewed contracts, trusts, and wills, ensuring that the intentions of the king himself were never lost. In doing so, they were not only preserving a fortune, but also safeguarding the stories, memories, and treasures that made up the life of Elvis Presley. Every decision had weight. Every signature had consequences. One of the challenges in these legal battles was understanding the complex web of inheritance laws, trusts, and estate planning. Elvis had left a will that was carefully crafted. But as years passed, new circumstances arose. People aged, fortunes changed, and additional documents were created. Each of these developments had to be examined in light of the original intentions. Lawyers needed to determine whether the new papers were consistent with what Elvis had wanted, or whether adjustments were necessary to ensure fairness and authenticity. Priscilla Presley's challenge to the estate documents also highlighted a universal truth about family and inheritance. Even when love and care are present, disagreements can happen. Her concern was not about creating conflict, but about clarity and protection for her daughter. The lawyers acted as guides, translating complex legal language into practical solutions and ensuring that the decisions made would stand the test of time, as they worked tirelessly to balance the wishes of the past with the realities of the present, always with respect for the family and the extraordinary life they were preserving. And to fully understand the statement about the document, you need to keep watching. Fraud and forged documents in Elvis's estate. Even decades after Elvis Presley left the world, the story of his life and legacy continued to unfold in unexpected ways. His voice could still be heard echoing through radios, streaming playlists, and countless albums, but beyond the music, a quieter and more complicated drama was playing out. This chapter was not about concerts, fame, or movie premieres. It was about trust, truth, and the careful protection of a legacy that belonged not just to one man, but to a family, to history, and to the countless fans who had grown to love him. In the years following when Elvis passed away, the management of his estate became increasingly complex. The king of rock and roll had accumulated more than fame. He had amassed a fortune, a home filled with treasures, and rights to music and performances that continued to earn money long after his death. Managing this empire required careful oversight, and over time, questions began to arise about the authenticity of some of the papers connected to his estate. These were not simple questions about spelling or dates. They were questions that could change the direction of millions of dollars, the control of Graceland, and the protection of the family legacy.
Among the papers that were examined in detail were documents related to loans, property agreements, and other financial instruments tied to Graceland.
Olnick, the mansion that had been the heart of Elvis's life. Lawyers and courts began to notice inconsistencies. Some documents looked suspicious, and certain signatures appeared unusual when compared to earlier verified examples. Even small anomalies in the text or format could suggest something more serious than a clerical error. These discoveries sent ripples through the legal world and the Presley family, raising the possibility that some papers might have been created or altered in ways that were not legitimate. The idea of fraud in this context was alarming but important to understand. Fraud in legal terms means that someone may have tried to misrepresent a fact, create a fake document, or manipulate official papers to gain an advantage. In the case of Elvis's estate, and if this could mean changes to loan agreements or contracts that might affect ownership, access to funds, or the management of properties, courts, aware of the enormous stakes involved, had to act carefully and decisively to make sure nothing unfair or illegal would impact the family or the estate. One of the most striking events occurred when a court blocked a deal connected to Graceland because the evidence suggested the potential for fraud. Judges, lawyers, and investigators examined every signature, every clause, and every date. They compared handwriting, checked notarizations, and reviewed the chain of custody for each document. It was a process that required patience, precision, and the understanding that a single mistake could have far-reaching consequences. For the Presley family, this was not just a legal matter. It was deeply personal. Graceland was more than a property. It was a symbol of their father, husband, and grandfather, a place filled with memories, milestones, and pieces of a life that could never be replicated. The allegations of fake documents highlighted the unique pressures that come with managing the estate of someone like Elvis Presley. Fame attracts attention, wealth attracts risk, and both can make it tempting for individuals to attempt deception. Yet in this story, the role of the law and the diligence of skilled lawyers were crucial. They acted as guardians, ensuring that every transaction was legitimate, every claim was verified, and every decision respected the legacy that Elvis had worked so hard to create. Imagine the work of those lawyers as a delicate puzzle. Each paper had to be placed correctly, and each signature verified, each agreement carefully analyzed. One misstep could allow someone to claim control over a piece of the estate unfairly, or even diminish the security of assets that had been set aside for Lisa Marie Presley, Elvis's daughter, and the remaining family members. The stakes were high and the scrutiny intense because the legacy of the king of rock and roll is not just financial, it is cultural, emotional, and historical. Through these investigations, the importance of authenticity became clear. When papers are forged or altered, it is not simply a matter of numbers on a ledger. It becomes a question of truth, trust, and respect. Those who loved Elvis and wanted to honor his memory needed to be confident that the documents guiding his estate were real, accurate, and reflective of his true intentions. The process involved experts in handwriting, law, and estate management, all working together to protect both the family and the historical integrity of Graceland. The court actions also served as a reminder that even the most iconic figures are not immune to the complexities of legal systems. Fame does not protect against errors, omissions, or deliberate acts of fraud. In fact, it can sometimes make such situations more complicated because more people are aware of the value and significance of the estate. The lawyers who stepped in to investigate these claims of forgery were performing a critical service, ensuring that no one could take advantage of the family and that the legacy of Elvis Presley would remain intact for future generations. One of the most striking aspects of this period is how it combined elements of mystery and diligence. The papers themselves were silent witnesses to history. They contained signatures, dates, and instructions, each telling part of a story about ownership, responsibility, and intention. Lawyers had to interpret these silent markers carefully, like detectives uncovering a truth hidden in plain sight. Every anomaly and inconsistency became a clue, helping to reconstruct the reality of what had happened and what was supposed to happen according to Elvis's intentions. it was also a deeply human story. Beyond the fame, beyond the money, beyond the courtrooms and investigations, there was a family trying to protect what their father, husband, and grandfather had worked so hard to build. For Lisa Marie Presley, and who had grown up in the shadow of a legend, the stakes were both emotional and practical. Protecting her inheritance was about ensuring stability and security, yes, but it was also about honoring the memory of the man who had shaped her life and the lives of millions around the world. Every decision in court, every review of a document, was guided by love as much as by law. The drama surrounding these forged document claims also highlighted the role of careful stewardship. Lawyers acted not only as enforcers of the law, but as protectors of history. They ensured that Graceland remained a place where memories could be preserved, that the intentions of Elvis were respected, and that the family could move forward without fear that false papers would undermine the trust he had established in his will and other estate documents. It was a story of diligence, integrity, and the quiet heroism of those who worked behind the scenes to protect something priceless. Even today, when visitors walk through Graceland, they see a home that has survived not only the passage of time, but also legal uncertainty. They see a house that holds the treasures, memories, and stories of a man whose music defined generations. They see a legacy protected by the careful work of those who understood that every document matters, every signature counts, and every action must honor the life of Elvis Presley. These events also remind us of the delicate balance between fame, wealth, and responsibility. When someone achieves greatness, the consequences extend far beyond their personal life. Decisions they made in life, papers they signed, and instructions they left behind can have ripple effects for decades. The careful review of alleged fraudulent document shows how important it is to preserve truth, verify authenticity, and respect the intentions of those who came before us. In the end, the account of these forged documents is not one of scandal or betrayal alone. It is a story of careful guardianship, respect, and the enduring power of legacy. The lawyers, the courts, and the family worked together to ensure that Elvis's wishes were honored, that his assets were protected, and that the memories of the King of Rock and Roll would be safeguarded for generations. Through patience, diligence, and a profound understanding of both law and love, they were able to protect not only the estate, but also the essence of a man who touched the hearts of millions. Even as new generations discover Elvis Presley through his music, films, and the story of his life, they can also learn from the quieter chapters, the ones that show that protecting a legacy requires more than admiration. It requires vigilance, care, and an unwavering commitment to truth. The investigation into potentially fake documents is a reminder that the life and memory of Elvis Presley continue to be treasured, respected, and preserved with great care. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.